welcome. My name is Jessica Rowland with Cal State Fullerton's Alumni Engagement Office, and thank you for joining us for our Go Vote Voter Education Series. This is our fourth year of doing this series. We're really excited about it. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Sarah Hill with us this evening to go over our propositions. Dr. Sarah Hill is a professor of political science here at Cal State Fullerton. She earned her Ph.D. in social science from the California Institute of Technology, and her research and teaching interests are in public policy as well as in state and local government. She currently serves as the Director of Graduate Studies at Cal State Fullerton. Dr. Sarah Hill, the floor is yours.
I want to say thank you all for being here, and I want to give a special shout out to the honors program. Thanks for being here tonight. I look forward to this. Every 2 years we get together and we do this now, and it's something that's a lot of fun for me, and I hope it's helpful to you. A special thank you to Jessica and to Alumni Engagement for making this happen. It is a pleasure to get to work with them, and I really appreciate it. We have 10 propositions to go over. We got our ballots yesterday. You have your voter information guide. So we are going to jump in and go over it together. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. Okay. Are we good? Y'all can see the PowerPoint? All right, thanks. So this is the November 2024 Ballot Propositions 101. Here we go. One of the places I always start is by reminding everyone, what is a proposition? We have 10 of them on the ballot. How did they get there? And they get there in different ways. And it's important to understand the process of how propositions end up on the ballot, because that can really inform how you decide to vote on it, because they get there in different ways. So there are 3 types of propositions that we can have on the ballot in California. Other states do different things, but this is what we do in our state. So first, and we have 5 of these on the ballot this time, is an initiative. And this is kind of what we traditionally think of as propositions. This is entirely created by the voters. Somebody had an idea that they thought should be a law. They have people stand outside of Target and Walmart and get signatures. They have to collect almost 550,000 signatures in 180 days. And if they can do that, then it's put on the next general election ballot. So we have several of those this time. And this is important to understand, once we vote for that, it can only be changed by another proposition. The legislature can't come back and change it on their own. It has to go back to the people again for a vote if we ever want to change it. So that's one way. We also sometimes have what's called a protest referendum. This is the legislature passed a law and somebody doesn't like it. They think it actually shouldn't be a law. And so they collect the same number of signatures in 90 days. You only have 90 days to get a protest referendum on the ballot. And if you can do that, then it forces a vote on the bill. It normally wouldn't have gone to a vote of the people, but you can force a vote on it, and we get to say yes or no. Now, this time, we actually don't have a protest referendum. We don't get a lot of these because the 90 days is a really tight time frame, but we've had them in the past. We had the plastic bag ban on the ballot a few years ago. That's an example of a protest referendum. And I want to go back. I realized I skipped something. When it's an initiative, you can either have a statute, which is just a regular law, or you can have a constitutional amendment, which actually changes the California Constitution, and that requires more signatures. But in either case, 180 days, it's a tight timeline. And then finally, this is what most states do. This is kind of the normal thing, is what we call a legislative referendum. This is something the legislature passed, and it's required to go to a vote of the people before it becomes a law. Lots of states do this. So if the legislature recommends changing the California Constitution, if they pass that, it then has to go to a vote of the people. You can't change the state constitution without a vote of the people. We have that on the ballot this time. If there are any bonds, so if the legislature wants to pass bonds, which is a way that the state goes into debt for major projects, that has to go to a vote of the people. And we have those on this ballot. And then you can also, if they want to make any change to a previous proposition, it has to go to the people for a vote. So we have 5 legislatively referred referenda on the ballot this time. And so that's where they're coming from. So depending on how you feel about the legislature, if you tend to agree with them, you might be more favorable to a legislative referendum. And then initiatives, we'll talk about kind of what different sides are saying yes or no on the initiatives. So that's just really good to understand how initiatives get there, or how propositions get there, and where they come from in the first place. I used several sources to do my research for tonight's presentation, and these are some that I recommend. I like them because they're nonpartisan and generally just good policy analysis, which I find very helpful. So you could look at Vote 411. That's by the League of Women Voters. I really like them because they're a good government group. They care about good government and they're nonpartisan. Cal Matters is a nonpartisan nonprofit website. They do journalism on California. They're a great resource for issues on California. The Secretary of State puts out the official voter information guide. That's the big, thick pamphlet you get in the mail. It's also available online, so you can always check that out. And then the California Legislative Analyst is a nonpartisan policy analyst who works for the legislature, and they always do an analysis of the propositions on the ballot. I find them very helpful as well. So those are some more resources you could look at if you feel like you want to dig into more information on any of these. I'm going to go through the propositions in order, and for each proposition, I'm going to cover the basics of what it is about. Some of these are complicated, so I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. I'm going to say, here's what a yes vote means, and here's what a no vote means. I know folks feel like sometimes it feels backwards. Which way do I want to vote? So I'll clarify that. And then I'm going to tell you what 3 different groups say in terms of their endorsements on the propositions. Like I said, the League of Women Voters I find helpful because they're nonpartisan. And then I'll tell you what the California Democratic Party says and the California Republican Party says. These are their official endorsements. All right, here we go. We got this. We got 10 of them. We can do this. First one is Proposition 2. This is bonds for schools and community colleges. It's a legislative statute. So this was put on the ballot by the legislature. They're asking the voters to approve the sale of bonds. This one is pretty straightforward. They want to borrow $10 billion, sell $10 billion in bonds to renovate, fix, and construct facilities in K through 12. $8.5 billion would be dedicated to K through 12. And then 1.5 billion would be dedicated to community colleges. And the way this would work is the districts who receive money, the school districts, would have to give matching grant. It would be matching grants, matching school district money. And the state does have a formula where they would give more money to less affluent districts to help them build with facilities. The reason for this is our schools are in bad shape. They're really in need of repairs, and the state funds, the state does this on a regular basis. They provide matching funds for public schools. That resource is depleted right now. And so the legislature is coming to the voters saying, we need to replenish this fund. Please approve this money. And the way we would pay it off is we would pay it off $500 million for 35 years. So $500 million a year for 35 years. That's how we pay off bonds, is a little bit every year with interest. The main concern about this one would be just the state going into debt, and it's a lot of money that we're spending. And so does the state have the ability to spend this money at this point in time? That would be the main concern about it. So if you vote yes, the state could borrow $10 billion to build or renovate existing public schools and community college facilities. And a no vote says no, the state could not borrow that $10 billion for public schools and community college facilities. So pretty straightforward. What's interesting, I think this is the only one where everybody agrees. Everybody actually says vote yes on this one. I think there's pretty strong consensus that we really do need this money for school facilities because we don't have it right now. And so there is pretty broad-based support for it. Any questions coming in, Jessica?
No, I think everyone understands this one straightforward. The no questions have come through.
Okay, great, thanks. Proposition 3. This one's really interesting. This would reaffirm the right to same-sex marriage. This was put on the ballot by the legislature. They are asking us to amend the California Constitution. So they've already approved this, and they're asking the voters to approve it. This would enshrine the right to same-sex marriage in the California Constitution. So a lot of you might remember way back in 2008, we had Proposition 8 on the ballot, which was an initiative that defined marriage as only between a man and a woman in California. That is still in the California Constitution. If you can look it up, it's in there. It has not been removed. But we have had US Supreme Court cases, in particular. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot outlaw same-sex marriage in the United States. So it is not being observed or implemented right now. Same-sex marriage is allowed in California, as it is throughout the United States, but the words are still there technically in the Constitution. So this would get rid of those words, and it would replace them to recognize the fundamental right to marry regardless of sex or race. Why is this coming up now? We've left it alone for a long time. It's because recent decisions by the US Supreme Court have overturned a lot of precedent, longstanding precedent. And when we had the Dobbs decision in particular, which overturned Roe versus Wade, there was a suggestion that we might want to go back and look at other cases like those related to same-sex marriage. Should that be overturned as well? And there's concern that one day the US Supreme Court might overturn that ruling. And so just in case that ever happens, the legislature wants to be clear what the policy is in California. So this won't have any fiscal impact. It's not changing any actions in California right now. The idea is, should the Supreme Court ever overturn precedent on same-sex marriage, California will be clear that same-sex marriage is legal in the state, along with regardless of race, right? Marriage is a fundamental right regardless of sex or race. So that's what this would do and why it's coming up now. So this would enshrine the right to same-sex marriage in the California Constitution. A yes would update the language in the Constitution to recognize the right to marry, regardless of sex or race. And a no would not change the language in the California Constitution. It would still say marriage is only between a man and a woman in California, but there's not an actual change in who could marry currently because of the current Supreme Court ruling. So a little bit awkward there, but that's what this would mean. The League of Women Voters and the California Democratic Party both endorsed voting yes on this, and the Republican Party stayed neutral on it and did not give a recommendation. Any questions on that one, Jessica? No? Okay.
Yeah, nope, we were ready to go on.
Okay. So far, we're pretty straightforward. Don't worry, the complicated ones come at the end. So we're good. Proposition 4, bonds to respond to climate change. So these are bonds, again, it's kind of similar to the Proposition 2 on school bonds, only these are bonds. It would be, again, $10 billion for actually a variety of things. It's kind of a mishmash of things, but all related to climate change, and that the state needs to be ready for how climate change is going to affect us. And because it's borrowing a large amount of money, the voters have to approve it. So this would include things like $3.8 billion for water projects, $2.7 billion for wildfire and coastal protection, $1.2 billion for fish and wildlife. So a variety of things. We're expecting the state will be affected in many different ways from climate change, and this is trying to get out ahead of that. A lot of folks say this still won't be enough. Even if it does pass, that we'll still have a lot to do to address climate change, but at least it would be a start. And in the proposition, at least 40% of it would have to go to low income or communities that are vulnerable to climate change. So it would be really targeted where it's needed. The main concern about this is, again, the cost to the state, because we'd be paying $400 million a year for 40 years to pay it off. And so that's the primary concern about it. So a yes vote would allow the state to borrow $10 billion for projects related to addressing climate change and how the state responds. And a no vote, that should say would not borrow, not $10, $10 billion for water projects. So a no would not let the state issue those bonds for projects related to climate change. The League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party of California both endorse voting yes on this, and the Republican Party endorses a no vote. Again, the primary concern is the cost to the state. Any questions?
Nope, still doing, we're doing
All
good.
right, maybe y'all did your homework ahead of time. I don't know. I think y'all are here for the last ones. Those are the questions I've been getting, or the ones that are coming later. That's what everybody's confused about. So we're gonna get there. All right. Proposition 5. This would decrease the vote that is needed for local government to sell housing and infrastructure bonds. So this would be a change to the California Constitution. The legislature is recommending it, and so it has to come to us for a vote. Currently, in order for local bonds to be issued, so this would be city, county, school district, for any of them to issue bonds, it takes a 2/3 voter approval. So 66.7% of the voters have to say yes if there would be any increase in property taxes. That is really hard to get. It's a very high threshold. So this would lower the threshold. It would decrease that to a requirement of 55% voter approval for certain bonds, not for all, but for our affordable housing programs and for some public infrastructure projects like roads and water. And so this is just to make it a little bit easier to pass those types of bonds. We did this a while back with school bonds. So school bonds also have a 55% requirement voter approval. We lowered that a while back, and it was just because it was too hard to pass them otherwise. And the argument is that we need this because it's so difficult to pass, but we need to be able to fund these kinds of projects. And so that's why the legislature is recommending lowering that requirement. Very similar kind of concern that this is going to increase property taxes, and that we might not, folks might not want that. They might not want their property taxes increasing, but again, they would only go up if 55% of voters say yes. So that's what that would mean. So a yes vote would decrease the voter approval requirement for local bonds for public housing and some infrastructure projects to 55%. A no vote would leave the voter approval requirement at 2/3 or 66.7% for public housing and infrastructure projects. So it would leave it at that level. The League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party of California both recommend voting yes on this, and the Republican Party of California recommends a no vote. Again, the concern is the increase in taxes, the increase in property taxes. That's an ongoing concern in California. Any questions? No?
Actually, a question came out just about the Proposition 4, and to confirm, the reason that the Republican Party is saying no to that one is because of the cost, correct?
Yes, the main concern there is just does the state have the money to pay for this? The payment for that will come out of just the general fund, the general state budget. And so that means we wouldn't have money to use elsewhere. And there's always a concern about the state spending more money.
Perfect, thank you. No other questions at this time.
Okay, great. Proposition 6 is the incarcerated labor ban. This is a constitutional amendment, so the legislature has recommended changing the state constitution. Currently, we have a constitutional provision in the California Constitution that allows involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. So this is, if someone is incarcerated, they can be forced to work. And if they don't, they are somehow punished. Most states do not allow this. Most states have this ban in place already. Involuntary servitude would be prohibited for any reason. So someone who is incarcerated could not be made to work. You can voluntarily work, so that is preserved, and you could get a reduction in prison time. So if you do volunteer to work, you can get credit for time served. There's an equity concern here. One of the reasons why this is being encouraged is that Black and brown communities have been disproportionately affected by the law currently allowing incarcerated labor. This is not expected to have a huge cost. It's not quite clear exactly how it will play out, but not more than tens of millions annually. And this is essentially the idea is this is one way California still allows people to be enslaved, forcing labor on someone. And many people want to do away with that provision and not allow the enslavement of anyone for any reason. So yes, would be involuntary servitude would no longer be allowed as a punishment for crime. You could voluntarily work if you're incarcerated. And then a no is involuntary servitude would continue to be allowed as a punishment for crime. And that is the only case in which involuntary servitude is allowed in California is as a punishment for crime. That's true in the United States. That's the only instance in which it's allowed. The League of Women Voters of California and the Democratic Party of California say yes. The Republican Party of California says no. There's not a lot of formal opposition to this. I think there's concern about the reason people would vote no is what does this mean exactly? What does it mean that people can work voluntarily? I think there's some concern about exactly how this would work out in practice. And it's something we've had for a long time. It is technically legal under the United States Constitution. And so some folks might want to leave it in place as what they think is an appropriate punishment for crime.
The question that came up is, do you have any reference on when they say work, the type of work, or like what do they, what does that mean?
That's a good question. I think it can be a variety of things. It could be, sort of any sort of, if we think of prison labor, working in the kitchen, cleaning. Some do produce materials and goods for sale. I think it could be just a variety of what people are required to do. And there's concern, like even if you're sick, they still sometimes require you to work. And if you don't, you face solitary confinement or loss of privileges, things like that, if you refuse to participate in the work assignment you're given.
Thank you. That was all the questions for this one.
Okay. All right. So those are the 5 that were put on the ballot by the California legislature. So sort of depending on how you feel about them, you may feel more or less inclined to vote yes or no. The next 5 are initiatives. So there's a group or an individual who really thinks this ought to be a law. They got the signatures, they got it on the ballot, and now we vote on it. The legislature was not involved in this in any way. This is up to the people if we want this to be a law. So we're going to start with Proposition 32, raising the minimum wage. This is fairly straightforward. It would, the details, are a little bit, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's overall pretty straightforward. That the minimum wage in California would increase to $18 an hour by 2026. That's the basic idea. So there's a little bit of a step in there for like smaller employers, but for everyone, the minimum wage would be $18 an hour for all employers by 2026. And then after that, it would continue to be adjusted for inflation every year. So it could continue to go up every year, just depending on what inflation is. The current minimum wage in California is $16 an hour. It's $20 an hour for fast food workers. And the current minimum wage is adjusted every year for inflation. So by 2026, we expect it to be about $17. So this would be, we're thinking just in terms of 2026, this would raise it to $18 instead of $17, which is about where we expect it to be. The arguments around this are pretty straightforward in terms of the normal arguments around minimum wage, that in California, if someone is working a minimum wage job, that is not enough to meet basic needs. And then the flip side is the concern is if we increase the minimum wage, it will hurt businesses, it will increase prices will go up, and it will also cost government because government has to pay people the minimum wage. So a yes would raise the minimum wage to $18 an hour by 2026, and it would continue to be adjusted for inflation in future years. A no would the minimum wage would stay at $16 and continue to be adjusted for inflation in future years. And again, I think you want to think about that 2026. In 2026, will the minimum wage be $18 or $17? And that's kind of the difference that we're thinking about. The League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party of California both say yes on this one, and the Republican Party recommends a no vote. Again, very standard arguments that we normally see anytime we see a debate over what the minimum wage should be in California or elsewhere.
No questions have come through for this.
Okay. Proposition 33. This is where it might start to get fun. I'm expecting to see some more questions from this one forward. So this is an initiative statute, so just a regular law. This would allow local governments, so cities, counties, to have rent control on single family homes and housing built after 1995. So current state law prohibits rent control on single family homes and housing built after 1995. That's the current law. We do currently have rent control in some cities. It just applies to other types of housing. The state would also not be allowed to adopt any laws that limit local government rent control. So this would very much put any decisions about rent control in the hands of local government. The reason why it's been put forward is the hope is that if there is an adoption of rent control, it would ease the housing crisis. We know that housing is incredibly expensive in California, and it's very difficult for people to pay rent. And so the hope is that this would alleviate that. The flip side, this is again, the very standard arguments you see about rent control anytime you're talking about rent control, is that it would actually make the housing crisis worse because it would discourage building. It would discourage developers because they wouldn't be able to make as much money, and it would actually raise housing costs because it would decrease the supply of housing. So standard arguments about rent control, should we allow this or not? The concern is it actually could have some unanticipated consequences of making the housing crisis worse. So a yes vote would allow local governments to adopt rent control laws for single family homes and housing built after 1995. And then a no means that the law stays in place that prohibits local governments from adopting rent control laws from single family homes and housing built after 1995. The League of Women Voters did not take a position on this one. I think they felt like it kind of could go either way, the pros and cons, so they didn't take a position. They stayed neutral. The Democratic Party of California says yes, and the Republican Party of California says no, very much along the standard lines of the arguments we hear about rent control.
Question came in is, what is the benefit to local government having rent control versus the state level having the control?
That's a great question. So some of the issue here is just a local control argument that local government should be able to make these kinds of decisions for themselves. The reason for the state to have a say is because the housing crisis is a statewide issue. And if some cities, let's say, or counties are adopting rent control that's making the crisis worse, it's going to affect at least the whole region where they are. And so the state wants to be proactive and not letting that happen by saying, we're just not going to do this. This is not going to be an option for rent control. So it's because there would be spillover effects to others in the region if one city decides this is what we're going to do.
And then if the house was built before 1995, but updated since then, is this still not included in the rent control bill?
That's a great question. And I don't know that. I'm not enough of an expert on rent control. That's an excellent question. We can maybe follow up on that one if you take a note of it, Jessica.
Yeah, I'll take a note of that one. And then a little bit of a follow-up to the first question. Is there any upcoming legislation to give the state more rent control that we should be aware
To give, I don't quite get that question. To give the state more rent control?
of?
I don't know if we can rephrase it.
Possibly, if the attendee that sent that question, if you can here it is. So this one allows local governments, but is there one that allows more state controllers?
Would the state be able to set rent control? No. So what the state
Yes.
has done is the state has passed the rent stabilization, which is different than rent control. So rent stabilization, that's in place. That's a state policy, statewide, is that your rent, once you're in, your rent can only go up by a certain amount from year to year. So your landlord can't raise your rent by 20% or something. It's limited. It depends on the cost of living, but between 5 to 10% is the most that your rent can go up from year to year. If you move out and someone new is moving in, they can raise the rent by as much as they want. That's different from rent control, where the price they charge is basically set. Even if someone new moves in, they get the benefit of that set price. Rent stabilization is just a benefit really for the current renter, knowing their rent won't go up by too much, but the next person who comes in, it could go up by a lot. So that's the state policy in place. And I think the state is planning to leave that. The state does, one of the difficulties with this is the legislature knows the housing crisis is an issue, and they definitely want to address it. In general, though, they're not in favor of rent control. What they would like to do is take different approaches to increasing the housing supply, to encourage building, to limit regulations, so that housing can be built as quickly as possible. Things like that are what they would prefer to explore versus rent control, which tends to have unintended consequences.
And then if a sorry, does a yes vote give the local government more power?
Yes. So a yes vote, I just went back there, but it would allow local governments to adopt rent control laws. So right now, on these types of housing, single family homes and housing built after 1995, they can't do anything. They don't have control there. This would give them the power to adopt that rent control if they want to, so it would give more power to local government to make their own decisions.
That's all the questions for right now on this one.
Okay. Okay, this is one of the ones that I had to do a lot of reading on this one to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So Proposition 34 is the spending of prescription drug profits. This is an initiative statute, so a law put on the ballot by voters who thought this should be a policy. This is kind of, the politics of this are fun. So what this would do is it would make some healthcare providers spend over 98% of their revenue from a specific discounted drug program on direct patient care. Okay, what does that mean? Here's the deal. Under federal law, there's a federal program that if you're a healthcare provider who serves disadvantaged groups, you can buy discounted pharmaceuticals. It's meant to encourage folks to be providers to disadvantaged groups. And you are able to then sell those discounted drugs at marked up retail prices to other patients who aren't from disadvantaged groups. So you can make a profit. The federal government is helping you make a profit in return for serving disadvantaged communities. The hope, the idea is that these providers will use that profit, that revenue, to expand their services to disadvantaged groups. So we're going to let you make profit, and we hope that that will encourage you to continue to serve and expand your services to disadvantaged groups. But they aren't required to do so. They don't have to, but that was the idea. So if you're a provider, a healthcare provider who meets certain conditions, this is going to require that revenue you're making from this program, you have to spend at least 98% of that, so overwhelmingly, on direct patient care, on directly serving your patients. What is this about? Where is this coming from? I'm glad you asked. The thing is, when you look at who this would apply to, it applies to one provider, one. And that is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, run by Michael Weinstein. This is basically, so you know about him. He's the one who got Proposition 33 on the ballot, the rent control proposition we just talked about. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation, you might be like, haven't we voted on rent control before recently? Yes, we have. This is the third time in a short period of time that rent control is on the ballot, and it's because he keeps putting it on there. He keeps trying to get it on the ballot. And that is really annoying people. It's annoying like realtors and folks who don't want rent control builders. And so they designed this specifically to try to stop him so that he would no longer be able to use his revenue from this drug program to keep putting rent control propositions on the ballot. So 34 is designed to stop propositions like 33 from ending up on the ballot again. Only in California, my friends. So this would only apply to healthcare providers who spent at least $100 million over 10 years on expenses other than direct care, like the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, because they keep spending money on getting rent control on the ballot. The provider has to own and operate apartment buildings, and they have to have had at least 500 health and safety violations. As far as anyone can tell, this only applies to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. So it is specifically to stop them. So it is designed to stop him from promoting rent control propositions. There's a real question of whether or not if this passes, if it's legal, because in general, laws are not able to be written so that they target an individual or like one organization. They need to broadly apply. And this is so obviously written to stop him. There will be a lawsuit if this happens, and there's a real question that this would be overturned if it does pass. I have my notes here, so I'm looking at that to see if I missed anything, because this, I know it gets so complicated. But yeah, it's the folks who are really upset at him for continuing to get rent control on the ballot. Only in California. So are there any questions on that one? I know it's complicated. It's the California Apartment Association. Landlord groups are the ones who are supporting this because they're so mad about the rent control that keeps ending up on the ballot. And so they're trying to stop him.
Can you kind of better more explain how this would how Weinstein gains from rent control, or how does he benefit, or his organization benefit from rent control?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's I'm not 100% certain on that why this is his cause, but it has been for a long time. I think so. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation does provide services to folks who are low income. They do own a lot of properties on LA Skid Row, and I think they want to try to help the housing crisis through rent control. I think that's the idea, is they're trying to be helpful in that way, but it's annoying a lot of people that they keep trying. It hasn't passed yet, and we're back again with Prop 33. So I think that's the idea, is for whatever reason, he's decided it's his cause. And so he keeps bringing it back to try to help with the housing crisis.
What if you believe in the spirit of the proposition, but not in this politically targeted move?
Oh, I love that question. That is often my feeling on initiatives, that I like where this is going, but I have a lot of questions about the details. What I would encourage there is that you vote no, because one of the things I really emphasize is we are stuck with this if we vote. The legislature can't fix it if it's not working. And then reach out to your legislators and advocate for the change that you support. The legislature can make these kinds of changes. We just have to let them know that this is what we want. So you could start advocating and working toward the kind of change you would like to see, and the legislature could do that on their own. We don't have to do it through this strange process we've got. And then we're stuck with it. The legislature could try it, and if it's not working, they could also then go back and fix it. So advocate for the policies you want through your legislators. That's what I would suggest. And that's how I feel about a lot of them.
I think, and some guests just wanted to confirm what a yes and or no vote would mean.
Sure. So
And
a
we
yes
support them,
vote,
yeah.
a yes vote. Healthcare providers who meet the conditions laid out in this initiative, just one, because they're very specific, and so it only applies to one. Any profits, their revenue that they get from this discounted drug program, they would have to spend on patient care. They can't keep spending it on getting initiatives on the ballot for rent control. So they're really trying to stop him. If you vote no, there's no change, and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation can continue to operate as they do. This one is interesting. The League of Women Voters, they didn't take a position. They don't have any, they only take positions on initiatives or propositions where they have a stance on that topic, and this is not something that they have a stance on. I think the Democratic Party wanted to stay out of it, and the Republican Party suggests a yes vote. So it's interesting that a lot of folks were like, I'm just not gonna get involved with this one.
No other questions coming.
Okay. Oh, Prop 35. I think this is the most complicated one on the ballots. And I had to do a lot of reading, and I still have a hard time fully wrapping my mind around this. So this is Medi-Cal funding. It would make a specific tax permanent to support Medi-Cal funding. So what does this do? Medi-Cal is California's version of Medicaid, which provides health care to low-income Californians. I've seen different estimates, but over 15 million Californians make use of Medi-Cal. So it's a huge program. For 20 years, we've had a tax, it's been temporary, on managed care organizations. So think of Kaiser Permanente, right? A lot of folks get their health care through Kaiser, and they are taxed. And that tax goes to helping pay for California's share of Medi-Cal. So Medi-Cal is paid for in part by the state and in part by the federal government. The federal government kicks in a lot of the funds, the state kicks in the rest. And it's expensive to serve that many people. So we have this specific tax that we've had for a while. It's changed over the years, and it has continued to be renewed by the California legislature, but it will expire at the end of 2026 unless the legislature reapproves it. To be clear, there's no sign the legislature wouldn't reapprove it. They always have, because they need this money. The legislature needs this tax money to pay for Medi-Cal. So it's not like we're really afraid this is going to go away. The real issue is, for many years, reimbursements to healthcare providers under Medi-Cal have been too low. Doctors, hospitals, whomever do not receive enough money in return for treating Medi-Cal patients. And so we're seeing more and more healthcare providers not wanting to treat Medi-Cal patients because they don't get enough money. And so what healthcare providers would want, they're the ones who are supporting this initiative, is they want the Medi-Cal reimbursements to be increased. And I think everybody agrees that's a real problem. I don't think there's any disagreement. The question is, how do we get there? How do we increase these? So what this would do is it would make that tax on managed care organizations like Kaiser permanent. And it would require that that revenue is spent on Medi-Cal and healthcare programs with the goal of increasing the reimbursements that healthcare providers receive for Medi-Cal patients. Again, everyone agrees this is a real problem. They don't think this is the way to fix it, though, necessarily. The problem is it is really specific in how that revenue would have to be spent, how the revenue from that tax would be spent. And it changes the way the legislature has currently allocated that tax revenue. And it increases the reimbursements that some medical providers will be receiving. And so the state is actually going to have to come up with a whole bunch of extra money. The estimate is $1 to $5 billion annually. It kind of depends, to fill in where this revenue has been reallocated. The other issue here, this is also very complicated because in part, this is all dependent on federal policy around Medicaid. And we do expect the federal government, actually under both the Trump and Biden administrations, this is an area where they agreed, I had no idea, want to actually change the way the federal government reimburses under these kinds of taxes. And if they do that, we're kind of stuck. The state would really have a problem in terms of not having enough money to pay for Medi-Cal, and the legislature wouldn't be able to change this. They'd have to go back to the voters for permission to make a change. So the concern is not that this is an issue. The concern is that this would stick us with a very specific revenue allocation that if the context and circumstances change, like if the federal government changes the way they handle Medicaid and the way they reimburse states, we could be in trouble because we're stuck with this old system that doesn't work with the new federal system. Leaving it in the hands of the legislature means the legislature, as needed, can adapt to any changes that come to us from the federal government. That is my best understanding of this. I have read so many things about it. It is so complicated. That is my best understanding of this. So if you vote yes, the tax on MCOs would become permanent, and that revenue would be required to be spent in specific ways on Medi-Cal and healthcare programs in ways that are different from what the legislature has currently allocated. If you vote no, the tax on MCOs will not be permanent and will expire in 2026 unless the legislature reapproves it, which they always have. There's not a reason to expect they wouldn't this time. This is supported by healthcare organizations, as you would expect, because they want to receive higher reimbursements, which I think everybody understands that that's a real issue. So that's who's pushing this and really supporting this. I think this is really interesting. The League of Women Voters says no, because they're really concerned that this would lock us in to a specific policy that might not be good if the federal government changes the way the formula works for Medicaid, and we can't do anything about it, versus leaving it in the hands of the legislature to try to adapt to. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party of California both say yes. And again, I think it's that they know there are real issues around Medi-Cal reimbursement, that's a real concern. I don't know if that made sense or not. How are we doing with our questions on that one?
We're doing good. No questions actually have come through on this one.
I'm shocked. I expected this to be the one that that everyone was most confused about.
Or maybe they're typing them away furiously.
Okay. All right. We'll see. We'll see. All right. Prop 36. This one
actually,
is
I'm so sorry, Doctor.
Nope, we got a question. Good.
One did pop in. If this is approved, can they raise the taxes?
The taxes. I don't. That's a good question, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know if the legislature would be able to increase the tax on MCOs. I'm not sure about that. That's a good question.
Perfect, thank you.
Prop 36 is also politically fun. This would increase penalties for theft and drug crimes. This is an initiative statute. This is an initiative to undo a previous initiative, because that's how we roll. So what this would do is it would increase penalties on some theft and drug trafficking crimes. So the history here is important. 10 years ago in 2014, Californians passed Proposition 47, which you might have heard about, which was part of our effort in California to make some nonviolent felonies misdemeanors. We were trying to decrease the population that's incarcerated. We were really trying to ease up on some of our tough on crime policies. We adopted lots of tough on crime through the 80s and 90s. We realized it was really expensive, and then we spent some time pulling back. So we made those changes to make some felonies misdemeanors. They have to be nonviolent. Prop 36 would undo some of those changes because they've been blamed for an increase in property crimes and homelessness. The argument is that because there's not a real penalty for theft, if you steal less than $950, it's a misdemeanor. There's been an increase in crime because people know there's not a real penalty for small theft. So this would turn some of those misdemeanors back into felonies and lengthen prison sentences. So the idea is if someone is a repeat offender, if they have several theft convictions, it's kind of a 3 strikes. Like by the third one, okay, now it's a felony because you have repeated this behavior. And then certain types of drug crimes would also get longer sentences than they currently do. And so it's to discourage the kinds of crimes that folks think have increased since Prop 47. The concern here is the increased cost to the state due to the increase in incarceration. We had previously pulled back because our incarcerated population was too large. This would increase it somewhat again, and that cost would decrease funding for treatment and rehabilitation, that's where we should be focused, not on longer jail or prison sentences. So if you vote yes, some misdemeanors would be turned into felonies and some sentences would be lengthened for theft and drug crimes. So it's somewhat, not completely, but somewhat undoing Proposition 47. If you vote no, there's no change. The current penalties for theft and drug crimes stay in place. The League of Women Voters and the Democratic Party of California say a no vote. They encourage a no vote. The Republican Party of California encourages a yes vote. This one is interesting because it's actually divided the Democratic Party. So far, this is polling as very popular. It is expected to pass. It's the most popular proposition on the ballot, I think, in terms of polling. But Democrats don't want it. In particular, Governor Gavin Newsom is against it, but he is not actively campaigning because it looks like it is so likely to pass. He said, I'm not going to put the time and energy into fighting it because it's going to pass. And so I'm going to put my time and energy somewhere else this election. So Democrats are divided on it. It's interesting when that happens, but it does look like this is very likely to pass. It's so far polling very well with the voters.
Any idea on what is currently spent on rehab and the treatment, and if it's effective?
Oh, what a question. I don't know that off the top of my head. That's a complicated question. It can be effective, but often, in particular for someone who has an addiction, it can take multiple tries. And I know that feels really frustrating that it can take many tries before someone is able to be clean and sober. So it's a really complicated policy issue. Yeah, that's something that my criminal justice colleagues could dig into with you for a long time, I know. Is that it?
Yeah, that was the only question that came through right then.
Okay.
Perfect.
That's the last one. Do you have any other questions, broadly speaking, any of them you want to go back to, or anything that we could try to talk about?
Yeah, actually, we did get a question on Proposition 2. So going back to the beginning.
All the way back to the beginning.
Um,
Those are the bonds. So just to remind everyone, those are bonds for schools, for
yes.
facilities. Yeah.
How is this different from Measure In? There's been some flyers around some neighborhoods about, Measure In and repairing in some elementary schools. Is different than Proposition 2, or can you go into that a little bit?
That's a great question. So they actually could go hand in hand. So I'm not sure where Measure In is, but it's going to be a local bond issue. So it's going to be a school district. So it's specific to your school district that is wanting to issue bonds to build schools in that specific district, right? Like you want new high schools or schools, it's that district. What Proposition 2 does, it's the same idea, only it's bonds for the entire state. So it would be distributed to school districts throughout the state. It could be distributed in part to yours because it requires matching from the local school district. So the local school district, through a Measure In, selling bonds might be how they match money coming from the state to then be able to build new schools. So they go hand in hand. It's just one is specific to that school district. Prop 2 is money from the state going to school districts throughout the state.
Thank you. And kind of on the bond measures, are all the $10 million dollars in the bonds issued at current interest rates?
Yes. So it would be, they would be, California has a process they go through to issue bonds that's done by the state treasurer. And yeah, they're issued at current interest rates and then paid off over the term of the bond. It's just like federal bonds. We have lots of state bonds we've sold over time. But the idea is it's current interest rates. And then the value of the bonds changes over time depending on how the interest rate changes. That's a whole finance course thing.
And then also, if Proposition 2 and Proposition 4 were passed, would the total repayment be correct at about 1 billion per year?
Great question. Yes. So if both pass, then we would be paying both of them off every year. So I'm getting my notes here. So for Proposition 2, we're paying about 500 million a year. And for Proposition 4, about 400 million a year. So it'd be 900 million a year for a long time. That is, I will say that's normally how we pay for large capital projects is through bonds. It's the state, it's just like how do we buy a house? You buy a house through a mortgage, which is borrowing money. It is very normal that government builds large capital projects through the sale of bonds.
Thank you. And then the last question that came through is, do you have any recommendations on places or ways to research some of these local district and county measures, or even how to research more on our local candidates?
Ooh, such a good question. So at the beginning, I recommended Vote 411, the League of Women Voters. I like them. The League of Women Voters has good information on your local candidates, and I think that's a good resource. Look at like your local newspaper often has, statements, or the voter information guide has statements. Some internet searching should lead you to some pretty good information about them.
If there's any more questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. But kind of see if there's anything coming else through.
Yeah. So if there's, I can hang out, but I just want to wish everybody happy voting. I love democracy happening. So when you're thinking about the propositions, think about how it got on the ballot. I always think that's an important consideration. Look at where the money's coming from on each side. If you look at Cal Matters, they tell you where the money is coming from, who's supporting each side. That's really helpful information. And go in with a plan. You've got this. Have fun voting.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Sarah Hill. I know if you can't hear them, but everyone's giving you a standing ovation, a round of applause right now. It's happening encore. No, but thank you so much for this. Thank you for everyone joining us this evening. We will be posting the recording of this on the YouTube channel, on the CSUF Alumni YouTube channel, and I'll make sure everyone gets the link to that once available. If you think of a question a little bit later on tonight, when you're kind of going through everything we just learned, feel free to email it over to alumnievents@fullerton.edu, and we'll make sure to get the question to Dr. Hill to get some answers for you there. If you haven't registered to vote, please do so. We are part of our CSU Ballot Bowl. We actually are winning right now. Cal State Fullerton is beating Long Beach. Woohoo! So we're going to hope that we continue to do so. But please stay informed, go vote, and thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.